Queen Camilla may wear the crown and the world finally accepted Camilla as queen, but acceptance does not mean inheritance. Queen Elizabeth knew that difference better than anyone alive, and in the quiet years before her death, she made a devastating decision. Hidden deep inside the impenetrable walls of the royal vault lies a priceless treasure that the late queen deliberately ensured Camilla would never lay hands on. This is the story of the ultimate betrayal from beyond the grave, and the historic snub Camilla never saw coming. The vault nobody talked about.
Centuries ago, when the St. Edward's crown was used for coronations, the jewels were hired in.
There are two kinds of royal wealth, the kind the world knows about and the kind the world is never meant to find. The crown jewels sit inside the Tower of London, behind bulletproof glass. It was guarded around the clock and visited by millions of tourists every year. The imperial state crown, the sovereign's orb, the scepter with the cross. These are the possessions of the state, not of any individual monarch. No king or queen owns them in any personal sense. They are borrowed for coronations and worn for the state opening of Parliament, and then returned to their vault when the ceremony ends. They belong to the institution, not to the person wearing them. Then there is the crown estate, vast, sprawling, and almost incomprehensible in scale. Hundreds of thousands of acres of land across England, Scotland, and Wales. The seabed surrounding the entire United Kingdom. Commercial properties in the heart of London. A portfolio valued at tens of billions of pounds and administered on behalf of the nation. It was generating revenue that flows directly into the public treasury. Again, no monarch owns this personally. It is managed in their name, not held in their hands. But here is what most people never think to ask. Beyond the state jewels and beyond the crown estate, what did Queen Elizabeth II personally own? What sat in the private inventories, the sealed leather folios, the quietly maintained collections that belonged not to the crown as an institution, but to Elizabeth Alexandra, Mary Windsor, as a woman? The answer is staggering. Over the course of 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II accumulated a personal collection of jewelry and heirlooms. She had historically significant objects that sits entirely outside the reach of the state, pieces gifted to her by foreign heads of government. Jewels inherited from Queen Mary, her grandmother, who was herself one of the most voracious collectors of royal treasures in modern history. Tiaras worn at private dinners and intimate family celebrations that never appeared in official portraits. Brooches that carried decades of personal meaning were worn on specific occasions, only for reasons that only those closest to her ever fully understood. Rings, necklaces, and earrings, chosen not for ceremony but for sentiment. This collection was never publicly inventoried. No catalog was published. No press release listed its contents. It existed in the way that the most significant royal possessions always have, quietly, deliberately, and entirely beyond public scrutiny. Royal historians who have spent decades studying the monarchy describe the scale of Elizabeth's personal collection as genuinely difficult to comprehend. The pieces that appeared in public photographs represented only a fraction of what she actually held. Behind the carefully curated public image of a queen who wore the same brooches repeatedly, who favored simplicity over ostentation, sat a private archive of objects whose combined historical and financial significance was extraordinary. And it was all hers to give away as she chose. This is the part of the story that the palace has never been particularly eager to discuss. When a monarch dies, the public conversation focuses on the constitutional succession. They focus on the transfer of official duties and state responsibilities. There will be more talks about who will now carry out the ceremonial functions that the institution requires. The question of personal property, of what the queen actually owned and where it goes, tends to get buried beneath the weight of everything else. But inside the palace, that question was never buried. It was very much alive, and the people paying closest attention to it were not constitutional scholars or royal historians. They were the people who stood to gain the most from the answer. Queen Elizabeth spent the final years of her life making decisions that the outside world was not meant to see coming. She updated personal documents. She had private conversations with trusted advisors. She made arrangements that were legally precise. arrangements that were deliberately sequenced and designed to withstand any challenge that might emerge after she was gone. People who served her closely during those final years have described a woman who remained sharp and deliberate. She was seen as a woman who was completely clear about her intentions right up until the end. She did not leave these matters to chance. She did not assume that the right things would happen naturally or that the institution would sort itself out. She knew her family and the palace. She knew the pressures, ambitions, and the quiet positioning that takes place inside any structure where power and wealth intersect, and she acted accordingly. What makes this story so remarkable is not simply what Elizabeth owned or where it eventually went. It is the precision with which she managed the transition, the legal instruments she put in place, the witnesses she chose, the timing she selected. Every element of the arrangement she constructed in those final years reflects a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. A woman who was not willing to leave a single opening for the outcome to be altered. There is one figure who appears again and again in the accounts of people who observed the palace during this period. One figure whose expectations were quietly but comprehensively disappointed by the choices Elizabeth made. One figure who had spent years operating on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. So wrong in ways that no amount of royal protocol or public dignity could fully conceal. That figure is Camilla, not Camilla, the villain of a tabloid story, or a caricature of ambition. But Camilla, as she actually existed inside the palace, the woman who had waited decades to be accepted and endured years of public hostility. The Camilla who had finally arrived at a position of formal legitimacy and who believed, as perhaps anyone in her position might have believed, that legitimacy carried with it a certain inheritance. It did not. And the story of how she discovered that, what it revealed about the woman who had made sure of it, is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in the modern history of the British monarchy. Ensure you keep on watching. What Camilla thought she was owed. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from surviving something that was supposed to destroy you. Camilla Parker Bowles spent the better part of 3 decades as the most publicly despised woman in Britain. She was seen as the other woman, the one who disrupted a fairy tale, the one whose name became shorthand for betrayal in a country that had watched Princess Diana suffer and had made up its mind about who was responsible. The hostility was not subtle. It was sustained, loud, and for years it showed no sign of softening. And then, slowly, it did. The marriage to Charles in April 2005 was the first turning point, not a triumphant one. It was not a moment of national celebration in the way that royal weddings are supposed to be, but a legal and institutional fact that could not be undone. Camilla was the wife of the heir to the throne. Whatever the public felt about that, the paperwork was real. Then came the years of quiet rehabilitation, the carefully managed public appearances, the gradual accumulation of charitable patronages, the moments of warmth that made their way into newspaper columns written by commentators who had once been among her harshest critics. The palace machinery worked steadily and patiently. And by the time Charles ascended the throne in September 2022, the transformation was largely complete. Camilla was queen consort. The world had not forgotten, but it had moved on. Inside the palace, however, moving on has never been quite as straightforward as it appears from the outside. People who observed Camilla during the years between her marriage to Charles and the death of Queen Elizabeth described her. They saw a woman who was acutely aware of her position within the hierarchy, a woman who knew where she stood relative to the other women in the family. She knew what her elevation to queen consort would eventually mean in practical terms. She was not naive about palace politics. She had survived them for decades at extremely close range. Camilla understood that titles matter, and she knew what proximity to power matters. She knew the symbolic possessions of the monarchy carry weight that extends far beyond their material value. And she had been watching the jewelry for years. This is not a secret within circles that follow the royal family closely. Royal commentators and palace watchers have documented for years the significance of specific pieces within Elizabeth's personal collection and the question of where they would eventually land. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara is perhaps the most discussed example. Created in 1893, worn by Queen Mary, inherited by Queen Elizabeth, it is a piece whose history reads like a condensed version of the monarchy itself. Elizabeth wore it at her own wedding in 1947. Diana wore it on her wedding day in 1981. When images of Diana in that tiara circulated after her death, they took on a meaning that went far beyond jewelry. They became a symbol of everything Diana represented and everything the palace had failed to protect. The question of who would wear it next was never simply a question about a tiara. It was a question about narrative, about legitimacy, about which woman the monarchy was choosing to align itself with symbolically in the eyes of the public. Camilla understood this. The people around her understood this. Years after her marriage to Charles, conversations started. Quiet conversations took place about which pieces from Elizabeth's personal collection might appropriately pass to the Queen Consort as part of the natural transfer of royal life. The word appropriately is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, because appropriateness inside the palace is never simply a matter of protocol or tradition. It is a matter of relationships and trust. It is about the invisible assessments that the people at the top of any institution make about the people beneath them. And the assessment that Queen Elizabeth was quietly conducting during those final years was one that Camilla and her inner circle appear to have significantly misjudged. There were signals, in retrospect, that something was not proceeding as Camilla expected. Requests that were received without response, conversations that did not go as far as hoped, moments where the expected affirmation simply did not arrive. People close to Camilla have described a growing unease during the period between roughly 2019 and Elizabeth's death in 2022, a sense that certain things that had seemed settled were perhaps less settled than they appeared. But unease is not certainty, and in the absence of a direct confrontation, it is remarkably easy to explain away the signals that something is wrong. Perhaps the timing was not right. Perhaps the conversations needed to happen at a different level. Or the arrangements would become clearer once the succession was formally underway. Camilla waited. She performed her public role with the discipline that decades of palace life had taught her. She attended the ceremonies, made the appearances, and delivered the carefully worded statements. She was, by every external measure, exactly what a queen consort is supposed to be. And inside, according to those who observed her most closely during this period, she was operating on an assumption that the vault, the personal collection, the privately held treasures that Elizabeth had accumulated over 70 years, would open itself to her in time. Not all of it. She was not reckless in her expectations, but enough to signal acceptance, enough to demonstrate that the woman who had once been the most hated figure in British public life had finally, fully, and irreversibly arrived. That assumption was about to meet the woman who had built the vault in the first place. And Queen Elizabeth, as those who knew her best will tell you, had never once in her 70 years on the throne made an arrangement she had not thought all the way through to its conclusion. Elizabeth's design, the transfer nobody saw coming. There is a phrase that appears in the private recollections of nearly everyone who worked closely with Queen Elizabeth II during the final decade of her reign. Quietly formidable. Not loudly formidable, not dramatically formidable, quietly. The distinction matters enormously because it describes exactly how she operated when the stakes were highest. There were no raised voices and public declarations. No moments of visible confrontation, just decisions, made with complete clarity and executed with legal precision. It was designed to be absolutely irreversible by the time anyone outside her innermost circle realized what had happened. The arrangements she made for her personal collection in the years before her death are perhaps the purest expression of that quality that has ever been documented. It began earlier than most people realize. Royal sources with direct knowledge of the process have confirmed that Elizabeth began the formal restructuring of her personal estate. She did it before her health became a matter of public concern. This was not a woman scrambling to put her affairs in order in the final weeks of her life. This was a woman who had spent decades watching what happened when royal transitions were managed carelessly. She saw when assumptions were allowed to harden into expectations, and when the absence of a clear legal framework left room for exactly the kind of maneuvering that she had observed at close range throughout her reign. She had no intention of leaving that room. The instruments she used were private, witnessed by people she trusted absolutely, filed through legal channels that sat entirely outside the public record. The specific mechanisms varied depending on the nature of the piece being transferred, its provenance and history. It's dependent on whether it had been gifted, inherited, or purchased privately during her reign. But the direction of transfer, in case after case, pointed toward the same destination, Catherine, not as an afterthought or consolation, but as a deliberate, considered, and legally documented choice that Elizabeth had arrived at through years of observation and assessment. People who were present during Elizabeth's private interactions with Catherine in the years after William and Catherine's marriage in 2011 describe a relationship that developed quietly, but with genuine depth. Elizabeth was not a demonstrative woman. She did not express approval through effusive praise or public gestures of warmth. She expressed it through access, through the conversations she chose to have, and with whom she chose to have them. She expressed herself through the small, almost invisible signals that those who knew her well understood to carry enormous weight. Catherine received those signals consistently. The public saw a composed young woman learning the mechanics of royal life. What was happening in private was something more significant. Elizabeth was watching how Catherine handled pressure. She watched how she handled the competing demands of public duty and personal dignity, and how she treated the people around her at every level of the palace hierarchy. She was conducting, in her characteristically quiet way, an assessment that would take years to complete, an assessment that would ultimately express itself not in words, but in legal documents. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara sits at the emotional center of this story, and it is worth pausing on it at length, because this piece is not simply jewelry. It is a thread that runs through the most significant moments of the monarchy's recent history. The tiara connects generations of women in ways that the palace has never fully articulated publicly, but that everyone inside those walls understands completely. Elizabeth wore it as a young queen. Diana wore it as a young bride. When Diana wore it on her wedding day in 1981, the image traveled around the world and lodged itself in the collective memory of an era. When Diana died in 1997, that image became something more than a photograph. It became a symbol of everything the monarchy had failed to protect, and everything the public had lost. For Elizabeth to direct that tiara toward Catherine was not a neutral administrative decision. It was a statement, measured and deniable in its specificity, but utterly unmistakable to anyone who understood the language in which the palace communicates its most important truths. It said that the line of symbolic legitimacy ran from Elizabeth to Catherine directly, not through Camilla or through the formal structures of consort succession, but directly, woman to woman, across the generation that had caused so much damage, to the generation that Elizabeth believed could repair it. Sources familiar with the arrangements describe Elizabeth in this period as a woman at peace with what she was doing. There was no visible anguish in the decisions, no second-guessing. She had made her assessments and trusted her conclusions, and she moved through the process of formalizing her wishes with the same steady composure that had defined her entire public life. By the time her health began its final decline, the architecture was complete. Every significant piece had a destination, every transfer had a legal foundation, every potential challenge had been anticipated and addressed within the documents themselves. Camilla had been given no indication that any of this was coming. The conversations that might have prepared her had never taken place. The signals that something was wrong had been there, for those paying close enough attention, but they had been easy to misread. They would not be easy to misread for much longer. The moment Camilla realized, the truth rarely arrives all at once inside a royal palace. It does not announce itself with a formal letter or a direct conversation, nor does it come with a moment of open confrontation that allows the person receiving it to respond with dignity and preparation. It arrives in pieces. Small, deniable, individually explicable pieces that accumulate over days and weeks until the picture they form together becomes impossible to look away from. That is how it arrived for Camilla. The first signal came through a request. In the weeks following Queen Elizabeth's death in September 2022, the palace moved. It went through the enormous logistical and ceremonial weight of a royal transition. Then, Camilla made an inquiry through the appropriate channels about a specific piece from Elizabeth's personal collection. The piece in question was one she had discussed informally on previous occasions. One that those around her had understood, or believed they understood, to be a natural fit for the incoming queen consort. The inquiry was received, it was processed. And the response, when it came, was not a refusal exactly. It was something quieter and in many ways more final than a refusal. It was the information that the piece in question had already been designated, that the arrangement had already been made, and there was nothing to discuss because the decision had already been taken, done legally and completely, before Elizabeth had drawn her last breath at Balmoral. Camilla's team asked for clarification. The clarification confirmed what the initial response had already made clear. The piece was not available. It had a destination, and that destination was not Camilla. People present in the palace during this period described the atmosphere in the days that followed as extraordinarily tense beneath a surface of immaculate public composure. The coronation was being planned. State visits were being arranged. The full ceremonial machinery of a new reign was grinding into motion. It was demanding attention and energy from every corner of the institution. There was no space, officially, for a private grievance about personal property. There was no forum in which Camilla could raise what she was feeling without it becoming something far larger and far more damaging than she could afford. So she did what the palace always does with things it cannot say out loud. She absorbed it. She continued to appear at the required events, continued to smile at the required moments, and deliver the carefully worded statements that the institution required of her. And she waited for someone to tell her that a mistake had been made, that the documents would be reviewed. She wanted to hear that there was a conversation still to be had. That conversation never came. The second signal arrived through an inventory. Palace archivists conducting the formal review of Elizabeth's personal estate produced documentation that made the full scope of the arrangements visible for the first time, not to the public or the press, but to the senior members of the royal household who had the standing to receive it. What that documentation revealed was not a single designation or a single piece redirected away from Camilla's expectations. It was a pattern, comprehensive, deliberate, and covering the full breadth of the most historically and symbolically significant items in Elizabeth's personal collection. The names that appeared as designated recipients were not Camilla's. They were consistent with the direction that Elizabeth had been moving in for those who had been paying attention for years. But seeing it rendered in formal legal language, in black and white, witnessed and filed, and entirely beyond challenge, transformed it from a suspicion into a fact. Royal insiders who have spoken about this period describe the mood around Camilla as one of cold realization rather than hot anger. She was not, by these accounts, a woman who raged or wept. She did not demand immediate answers from the people around her. She was a woman processing the discovery that an assumption she had carried for years, quietly and privately, had been wrong, comprehensively and irreversibly wrong. The third signal was the one that made everything else impossible to explain away. It came in the form of a public appearance. In the months following the coronation, Catherine appeared at a state occasion wearing a piece from Elizabeth's personal collection, not the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, but a piece that those inside the institution recognized immediately, a piece whose history was sufficiently well known among the senior household staff and royal correspondents. Its appearance on Catherine rather than Camilla communicated something that required no accompanying statement or press release. The transfer was real, it was visible, and it was permanent. What makes this part of the story so quietly devastating, at least from Camilla's perspective, is not the loss of the objects themselves. Jewelry, however historically significant, however laden with symbolic meaning, remains at some level a material thing. What Camilla lost in those weeks and months of accumulating realization was something considerably harder to replace: She lost the narrative she had been constructing about herself. Narrative she built patiently and painfully, across 3 decades of public hostility and slow rehabilitation. The narrative that said the suffering had been worth it, that the waiting had led somewhere. Narrative that the woman who had endured everything the public threw at her had finally, in the most unambiguous terms the monarchy knows how to deploy, been accepted. Elizabeth's arrangements said something different. They said that acceptance and trust are not the same thing, that endurance and endorsement are not the same thing. And a title, however genuine, however hard-won, does not by itself confer the kind of legitimacy that the monarchy reserves for the people it has chosen to carry its future. Camilla had the title, Catherine had the vault. And somewhere in the quiet, carpeted corridors of Buckingham Palace, in the weeks after the inventory was reviewed and the requests were declined, Camilla watched as the public appearances began to tell their own story. She understood that distinction in a way she had never been forced to understand before. The palace moved on. It always does. But the woman who had built the vault and the woman who had been chosen to inherit it had between them written a verdict that no subsequent ceremony or public gesture could reverse. Catherine's rising inheritance and what it means. In the royal family, some kind of authority cannot be manufactured. It cannot be scheduled into a public appearance or drafted into a press release. It cannot be conferred by any title, however ancient or however significant. It accumulates, slowly, invisibly, through the combined weight of moments that individually seem unremarkable, but that together constructs something the public recognizes instinctively, even when it cannot articulate what it is seeing. Catherine has been accumulating that authority for years, and in the period following Queen Elizabeth's death, the accumulation accelerated in ways that nobody inside or outside the palace had fully anticipated. The cancer diagnosis changed everything. In January 2024, Catherine underwent abdominal surgery at the London clinic. The palace issued a statement that was careful in its wording and limited in its detail, as palace statements always are. What followed was weeks of silence, then the slow emergence of speculation. After that, it was confirmed in March 2024 that Catherine had been diagnosed with cancer and had begun a course of preventive chemotherapy. The announcement, delivered in a video that Catherine filmed herself in the garden of her home at Windsor, was unlike almost anything the modern monarchy had produced. It was direct and personal. It was delivered without the usual architecture of royal communication, and without the careful positioning and the institutional distance that the palace typically maintains between the family and the public. The response was overwhelming. People who had followed the royal family for decades described something shifting in the public relationship with Catherine during those months, in a way that is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The carefully maintained image of a composed and elegant princess, always perfectly turned out, always precisely on message, had always inspired admiration, but also a certain distance. Admiration and warmth are not the same thing. What the cancer announcement produced in the weeks and months that followed was warmth, genuine, widespread, and of the kind that the palace machinery cannot generate on its own, no matter how skillfully it operates. Catherine came back. Her return to public duties in the summer of 2024 was managed with characteristic care, but the reception it generated went beyond anything the palace had planned for. The appearances at Wimbledon and Trooping the Colour produced responses that royal correspondents struggled to contextualize. This was not the polite affection that the public extends to working members of the royal family as a matter of course. This was something closer to the emotional investment that the public had last directed toward a member of the royal family in the years before Diana's death in 1997. Inside the palace, that shift was not lost on anyone. The timing of Catherine's inheritance of Elizabeth's most significant personal pieces needs to be understood against this backdrop. Because the transfer of objects, however legally precise and carefully arranged by Elizabeth in her final years, does not exist in isolation from the public context in which those objects eventually appear. What Elizabeth had designed as a private legal arrangement was being validated in real time by a public that was making its own assessment of which woman it trusted with the monarchy's future? The answer the public was arriving at was the same answer Elizabeth had arrived at years earlier, through entirely different means. William's role in this period deserves attention because it illuminates something important about the generational shift that was underway. The decisions that William made in the years following his father's accession to the throne were consistent and deliberate in their direction. The removal of figures from the duchy payroll who were associated with the previous generation's way of operating. The restructuring of the household around people that William and Catherine had chosen themselves. The quiet but unmistakable drawing of a line between the reign that had ended and the reign that was coming. These were not impulsive decisions. They reflected a considered view about what the monarchy needed to look like in order to survive the next 50 years. And central to that view was Catherine. Not as a supporting figure, or as a consort in the traditional sense of a woman who stands beside the significant man and performs the required functions, but as an equal partner in a project whose stakes William understood completely. The pieces from Elizabeth's collection that began appearing on Catherine during this period carried that understanding with them. Each appearance was noted, discussed, and decoded by the royal watchers and palace correspondents, who track these things with the attention that financial analysts give to market movements. Each piece told a story about continuity, and about the line that ran from Elizabeth through to Catherine. They told a story about the kind of monarchy that was being constructed for a generation that had grown up watching the institution nearly destroy itself in the 1990s, and had formed its own views about what needed to change. What had needed to change, in Elizabeth's assessment and in William's, was not the institution itself, the ceremonies, the history, the symbolic weight of a monarchy that stretched back 1,000 years. These were not the problem. The problem was the gap between what the institution represented publicly and what it was willing to protect privately. Diana had fallen into that gap. The damage had been generational. Catherine was Elizabeth's answer to that damage. Not a replacement for Diana. That framing is too simple and reductive. But a demonstration that the institution had learned something, that it was capable of recognizing and protecting the kind of person it had once failed to protect. That the vault, with everything it contained and everything it symbolized, would this time be given to someone the monarchy was prepared to stand behind completely. Camilla had survived the institution. Catherine had been chosen by it. That distinction, invisible to the outside world in the daily choreography of royal life, was everything inside the palace walls. It was what Elizabeth had spent her final years putting into legal documents. It was what the inventory had revealed. It was what the public appearances were, piece by piece and occasion by occasion, beginning to make visible what the vault really contained. Everything this story has covered, the inventory, the declined requests, the accumulating signals, and the legal instruments drawn up in the quiet years before Balmoral, points toward a conclusion that has very little to do with jewelry. The vault was never really about what was inside it. Royal collections of the kind Elizabeth assembled over 70 years are significant, historically and financially, beyond any reasonable dispute. The pieces are real, and their value too. The question of who inherits them carries consequences that extend across generations. None of that is trivial, and none of it should be dismissed. But Elizabeth was not a woman who thought in terms of objects. The people who knew her best are consistent on this point. She thought in terms of institutions. In terms of the long arc of a monarchy that had survived civil war, abdication, 2 world wars, and the kind of internal collapse that the 1990s represented. Every decision she made, including the ones that looked personal from the outside, was filtered through that institutional lens. What serves the crown? What protects the line? What ensures that the thing she had given her entire life to defending would still be standing, be trusted, and be capable of doing what a monarchy is supposed to do, long after she was gone? The vault, understood through that lens, was not a collection of precious objects. It was a transfer of confidence, a formal, legally documented, entirely irreversible statement about which woman Elizabeth believed the monarchy's future was safe with. She had watched Camilla for years. She had accepted her, formally and publicly, in the ways the institution required. She had supported Charles in the marriage. and had managed the rehabilitation with the skill that only someone of her experience could have brought to it. None of that was insincere. But acceptance, as this story has shown, was never the same thing as trust. And trust, of the particular and total kind that Elizabeth was putting into those private documents, was something she had arrived at through observation that spanned not months but decades. Catherine had earned something that could not be conferred by ceremony or manufactured by palace communications. She had earned it through consistency. She got it through the way she treated the people around her, and through her handling of pressures that would have broken people with less internal resources. She earned the Queen's trust through the cancer diagnosis and return that had shown the public and the palace the precise nature of what she was made of. Elizabeth had known it long before the public did. The vault opened for Catherine because Elizabeth had decided, quietly, legally, and with complete finality, that Catherine was the person the monarchy needed at its center for the next phase of its history, not as a figurehead, or as a symbol, as the genuine article. The woman who would carry the weight of the institution the way Elizabeth herself had carried it, without complaint, without self-pity, and without ever losing sight of what it was all actually for. Camilla lost more than jewelry in those weeks of quiet realization following Elizabeth's death. She lost the version of her own story in which the suffering had been fully redeemed. She retained the title, palaces, public position, and everything the institution was formally obliged to give her. But the vault and everything it represented had already gone somewhere else. It had gone to the woman Elizabeth chose, and in the monarchy that Elizabeth built, that choice was the only one that ever really mattered. That is the story of the vault that Camilla never opened, and the woman who made certain she never would. Queen Elizabeth II spent 70 years making decisions that the outside world only fully understood in hindsight. This was one of them, quiet, precise, and permanent. If this story made you see the royal family differently, let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones the palace would prefer you never heard, make sure you are subscribed because there is a great deal more still to come.